Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Chris Coulter, and I'm the Executive Director at the Berghoff Foundation. I hear that we have many people participating today, so welcome, everyone. Today's event, as was written in the chat, is only available in English. If you have any technical difficulties, don't hesitate to reach out. Spring has arrived in Berlin, so we're happy about that. It's been terribly cold. It's also been, it's a fourth world we live in. But we wanted to commemorate or remember that about a year ago, many of us met in Berlin for the Berlin Moot, the first of its kind, hopefully not the last. And one of the things that we discussed was the environment that we as peace mediators exist in and what can be done to advance the peaceful settlement of conflicts. 1 year later, we're in a very different global world, but we will persist in our message that we do actually believe that it is possible to settle conflicts amicably. Today, I have three distinguished speakers that will join me in a 1 hour conversation about issues of inclusive mediation, process design, design of venues, etc. I will proceed to interview them or to introduce them. But I wanted to start off because the communications team and I, we were discussing sort of the format of this conversation. And they asked me if there was one thing in particular that from my own experience that I could recall that made an effect or an impact. And I have to say that I played a very, very minimal role in the Havana peace talks between the FARC and the Colombian government. But there was one thing that really struck me in how it relates to inclusivity, but for me, actually, what struck me most was how to get unstuck. You have two conflict parties, and they do not share opinions about many things. And it was when the Colombian government and the FARC decided to put the victims in the center. And one of the negotiators on the government side, Sergio Jaramillo, he has talked about it many times since, that by putting the victims of both parties between them, created this space where they could actually remove themselves from their own positions in a way. So for me, it's also, yes, it was inclusive. They invited victims to the conversations and victims organizations, but it also sort of unstuck that competitiveness between them in their positionality. So in terms of process design, I thought it was so interesting. So that's one. Another one was from a process I cannot name, as is so often the case. But a third-party government approached me in a previous job to ask for help in their facilitation of two conflict parties. And that were just so stuck and were not going anywhere. And I just asked to see like a picture of the room. Can you just show me a picture of the room? And I don't know if you all remember when I say Putin's table, do you know what I mean? Like that, the longest table one has ever seen. So this table was much like that. Plus, there were around 50 chairs in the back for observers. And it made the parties feel so uncomfortable. They were just observed all the time. And the table also made for less constructive conversations. It didn't make for trust. It was a shouting match. So that was another very concrete example of if you can change venues, you can change the way. And even my old boss Jan Eliasson would always have this joke about the coffee machine. Like there are practical things that you could do. So those are just like one process and one very logistical example from that I remember. So if you recall, the Berlin Moot, it focused on many, many different things. But one of the things was sort of how can we cooperate both as third parties? How do we build trust? And then this famous slogan, there's not a unanimous phrase yet, but let's call them emerging actors for now. And according to a well-sourced person, that's actually what they themselves call themselves. We also talked about how the linkages between levels, like how to engage with grassroots, how do you engage with women and other local actors. And Katja, you will remember, I think it was the first time we met. I came into mediation, full disclosure, through the Women, Peace and Security agenda. These two were not always aligned. And I would say, since having left that world a bit, since then I've learned a lot. But I think that my three guests today, Katja Papagiannini from HD, Itonde Kakoma from Interpeace, and Pema Dunebal from the Dutch Foreign Office, we all grew up in a very specific era as mediators or as people who are involved in supporting peace processes. We grew up with certain resolutions, certain types of conflicts, and that they shaped it. We were socialized in a way by the times where we grew professionally. Today, the world is very different from those formative years of our own careers, to be honest. So I would like to think a bit about how we see the world going forward, but also how we think about lessons learned, what works, what actually doesn't work anymore, what are the biggest challenges, to explore these shifts in mediation. And for my two guests, Katja and Itonde, they have very hands-on mediation experience, but we're also very interested in another third-party experience, that of government. So in this instance, PMA from the Foreign Office in the Dutch government. Like, what is the role of that kind of third party, either as convener or as a supporter from the side? What can we do? I think it's very important to know our different roles. What roles do each and every one of us play in peace mediation? So without further ado, Dr. Katja Papagiannini, Director of Policy and Mediation Support at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue in Geneva. Very welcome. Mr. Itonde Kakoma, President and CEO of Interpeace, also in Geneva. And just to have some European diversification, we have Mr. Pema Dunebal he's the Senior Policy Officer on Peace Building and Mediation in the Netherlands. So, Katja, having been through all of, throughout your career, having had to deal with parties who are just not interested to speak, but you managed to get them to the table, and then you in the past 10 years have had to say the magic words inclusion. Many of us believe that to get an agreement is one thing, but then to get sustainable peace is quite another. But in this sphere of where you have been working, what is needed to make, if we're so lucky to have a table, sometimes we don't even have a table, but if we're so lucky to have one, that it is in fact representative, somewhat at least, of the conflict parties' reality, in a way that at least doesn't weaken the negotiation process. Over to you, Katja, for that very easy question.
Yes, very nice to see you, Chris, and Tonde and Pema and everyone who has joined us today. It's actually nice to have the opportunity to commemorate the Moot. It was a really lovely gathering last year with a lot of thought-provoking conversations. So I hope that it will take place again, Chris. So the inclusion discussion is it's a very timely one, but also difficult for the reasons that you mentioned, Chris. And I thought in preparing for this conversation of just sharing two ways in which I think about it very practically and pragmatically, and hopefully this will help us kickstart our conversation together. And the first is that when I think about ensuring inclusion in peace processes, I try to think always about what is the goal of that particular peace process at that particular moment. Because of course, peace processes are very diverse. They have different goals at different stages of their lifetime, and sometimes that lifetime can be decades. And they, in some cases, try to create simply channels of communications among actors. In other cases, they may try to put together a local violence reduction mechanisms. In other cases, they may try to bring the parties together in order to discuss agendas for actual negotiations. And then there is the format and the possibility of a very inclusive national dialogue or community level dialogue that brings together many stakeholders to develop joint visions and joint understandings for the future. So given this variety, I think what is important and useful for a creative peacemaker and mediator is to always think, what is this process currently trying to achieve and who needs to be at the table at this moment in order to get to an agreement and then to be able to implement that agreement. Because at different stages, we need different skills, different networks, different contributions in order to get to the agreement and to implement the agreement. And once you have a clarity about that, it's easier, not easy, but easier to then make arguments for inclusion. So to give an example, for the past 10 years, HD has been working at the local level in Nigeria, facilitating dialogues among communities. And some of those settings are extremely violent and very unstable and volatile. So inclusion there is not something to be taken for granted. And so, for example, when the dialogues are about figuring out ways to share natural resources in a way that will not lead to conflict, and once we know exactly what the goal of the dialogue is, we're able to then say, well, it seems reasonable to expect that the participants in this dialogue will be, for example, farmers associations, local businessmen, local government officials, civil society groups, women's organizations, because it's clear that the goal of the dialogue needs all of the stakeholders at the table in order to get to that final outcome. So one entry point for advocating for inclusion and for designing inclusive processes is to always have in mind what is it that we're trying to accomplish and who is needed at the table to get to an agreement, but also to implement the agreement. The second way that I think about it, Chris, is I think you referenced it also, is that to think beyond the one table. I think this conception of the one table is a bit of a straitjacket analytically. And the reality is that peace processes have multiple tables. Some of them are competing, some of them are overlapping, but essentially they're very complex and dynamic political processes. So if you think of peace processes as a set of multiple tables that are in a dynamic conversation with each other, then the possibilities for inclusion multiply because you haven't focused your mind and your creativity only on one table. And so the job then of the creative peacemaker, I think, is to be able to visualize exactly what is this network or this complex of multiple tracks and tables that exist in a given setting, and then to identify what are the gaps in inclusion, and then to try to fill those gaps as they exist in individual tables or in how the tables connect to each other. To give an example, in one of the processes that I also cannot name, we were discussing with the parties about the possibility of a ceasefire. And there were, of course, different conversations on ceasefires between different actors, between political parties, between the armed actors in the conflict, between the regional actors, etc. But it was clear that in that particular setting, there wasn't a voice or an organized forum for the voices of women and civil society when it came specifically to the question on what a ceasefire could look like. So having identified this gap, then we as HD with other partners thought of building the capacity of women and civil society specifically on the question of ceasefires. and then providing a forum, a dialogue space for them to think about what are their positions when it comes to ceasefire, what do they think are the options, what is the role of women in implementing and monitoring ceasefires, etc. So this is how I suggest that we start our conversation very practically and pragmatically. One, thinking always what is it that we're trying to achieve with the peace process and who is relevant in helping us get there. And the second is to avoid the straitjacket of the one table and to think in terms of complex political processes that offer very variable openings for the participation of women and civil society within them.
Thank you, Katja. No, I think you're so right on the multiple tables. And as we know, sometimes it's not an actual table as well. But to be very sort of what's the purpose, what's the goal, be very practical and pragmatic, and trying to find entry points. Another thing that we discussed at the Moot was also certain thematic issues, which made me realize now that you're talking about also entry points. So if a third-party government that wants to support a process has a very clear agenda on, for instance, women's inclusion, say, and want to push the parties for this, but they're stuck. But sometimes being very practical, saying what's the effect of climate change, or as you said, business interests, or then you can actually, in a way, bypass that if there's a resistance to what some people call a Western normative agenda, I would assume, to be super practical.
Yeah.
Itonde, please join us in the conversation. Itonde, I've known you for some time, and you also have very, very hands-on experience of mediating multiple tracks, not least very high-level negotiations as such. But I know you very well, and inclusion has also been sort of at the core of who you are, not just gender, but in terms of society at large. Some of the question I asked Katja, how can we be, as third-party sort of mediation actors, what can we do to actually improve inclusivity in peace processes?
Well, thank you, Chris. It's always good to see you and Katja and colleagues online. First, I think when we look at peace processes and assert a value, a principle, an approach of inclusivity, it's also an expression of what peace is about. And ultimately, it's about the fullness of expression of a diverse set of perspectives, experiences, and participation of a whole of society approach. If that is the case, which I believe it to be so, then what does it mean for a peace process that is overtly or subtly non-inclusive? It means that it's problematic from a point of view of process design, but as Katja outlined, there are options therein. I think first off, in terms of the excuse we hear most readily and frequently is about those who need to sit in terms of negotiating formal peace agreements must be those with power, oftentimes those holding weapons, guns, and mostly men. So we're talking about men with guns. And men with guns with both political and economic power. But we see time and time again that a sole focus, understandably, around a particular approach to a peace process design that's focused on those with guns who are predominantly men will not bring about lasting peace. And so it makes the case for a non-inclusive approach as not being good for peace itself. Meaning, we can point to specific examples. Sometimes they are hailed by the international community because weapons have stopped bringing about destructive force on communities. People have stopped dying. And so we welcome these types of agreements. But then when you look a bit closer and you see that no single woman was at the table, no broader perspective of society fully or properly represented, we often find those types of agreements are short-lived and in fact can begin to plant seeds for fueling further conflict and also erupt other unresolved issues within society. I want to give a very specific example. I refrain from doing so given the public nature this, but I'll just say in the Horn of Africa, we have seen that an exclusive elite bilateral agreement to the exclusion of women and to that of broader perspectives in societies, while it brought down or decreased the level of active armed conflict in a particular area, unleashed a much more destructive societal type of fracturing in other parts of the country with broader regional implications. And I personally see a direct correlation between the manner in which that agreement was reached, the non-inclusive nature of it, and the consequences or ramifications it has had on the prospects for peace in that particular region and particular country within the Horn. That alone should say to strategists, to politicians, to mediators, yes, about values, but also about what makes for better peace processes.
That makes me think it's also about a particular location in the Horn of Africa where there are multiple mediators. There's no lack of mediators there. So in terms of who takes ownership, how you coordinate, because that's one of the things that we also talked about in the Moot is sort of coordination, not necessarily collaboration, but at least coordination of these intensely complex processes. As an INGO involved globally, is it under frozen?
No.
Okay, you're just intently listening.
Listening so intently, Chris.
No, but I'm just curious. I mean, that's just one example, but what can we, and as well as HD Berghoff, we are non-governmental organizations. What can we do to influence not only conflict parties, but actually multilaterals, regional organizations, and in some cases governments? What would you say, based on your experience, in terms of this thing on inclusivity?
So, if I may respond in two ways. Firstly, with regards to what the lack of full support, full mandate from member states of multilateral bodies mean for the advancement of peace and complementarity by way of independent private diplomacy institutions, non-governmental organizations in supplementing those formal efforts. It has consequence. Our entire field has been built up to complement processes that are backed, sustained, and can benefit from informal. And what we see, not universally, but as a pretty serious trend, is that those formal processes are not being given or do not enjoy that center of gravity, that ability to pull around a common strategic direction, as we have been perhaps accustomed to in previous years, making it harder to then present a complementary, independent case. What are we anchoring our efforts around if the formal processes are non-existent or parallel without a common strategic intent? This is a crucial challenge to be addressed. If I could point to a personal experience, and I will give specificity here with full understanding from the parties and those involved that I do it in good faith. So less than 2 years after the independence declared of South Sudan, you know it, the country breaks out in civil war. And there were formal processes immediately underway, led by IGAD. But at a moment of so many changes taking place globally, including within the region, generational shifts in leadership, broader types of geopolitical struggles, many of which we see playing full out today, but the earlier onset of them were already showing their colors and having consequence for the coherence of an approach. I refer to this because in that capacity previously, in a different role, we were let's say, tasked by the principal belligerents at that time to bring about an independent space, which quickly shifted into the formal space, quickly, with a speed that we did not anticipate to a fault. And I'll fast forward because if we speak of the successes of that, it was the identification of the root causes around about struggle for power within a political party that wasn't being sufficiently addressed in the formal process. What we failed to do was exactly to your question, to ensure that it was sufficiently in complement to, not competitive to, the formal process. Despite all efforts to complement official statements from the UN, from the African Union, from IGAD, etc., commending the approach, the reaching of a formal agreement by the same parties in the formal process, but were willing to advance through their own means in the independent space. But ultimately, the politics were off. There was mistrust about what was at stake in the independent process vis-a-vis the formal, and the egos of states, of men, got in the way of really enabling that to be in full complement. And I reflect on it greatly now because it was a missed opportunity in so many ways to demonstrate how the belligerents themselves say, this is the issue we must address, drawing upon your earlier reference, putting victims at the center, aiming to reform their own and reflect upon their own past, to take responsibility for bringing their country down in war, but we failed to align in the changing political dynamics with consequence then for the sustainability of that agreement which was reached. It's a harder point to make now in the absence of anchors, centers of gravity around which we can build processes. But it's a necessary discipline to pursue. And I think part and parcel of what it means to do professional, quality, independent work.
Thank you, Itonde. Many lessons learned there, I feel, from those processes. And I will get back also to you, Katja, on how we can use what we've learned to some of the conflicts that are challenging us today. But before that, Pema, as a representative of a government that has been invested and is also supporting both processes and organizations in civil society, both locally and internationally, to promote inclusive peace processes. From where you are sitting, I was talking about having different roles, but from where you are sitting, and with the people that you engage on or engage with on the same level, how can external actors like you ensure that peace processes writ large are well coordinated and that whatever you do actually contributes to that goal that, in a sense, Katja was speaking about before? Pema, welcome.
Thank you very much, Chris, and big footsteps to follow after Itonde's and Katja's remarks. Maybe before I start, I would like to highlight 2 points. The first one is that this morning our government collapsed, which, so please bear with me and don't regard all I'm gonna say as like very formal statements on how we at this moment view certain policies. Because, well, as you all know, lots of uncertainty with the collapse of a government. And the second point, indeed, and then what you mentioned, Chris, as the Netherlands, we are not a historically we are not like a very not a mediator, right? Not like Switzerland or Norway in that sense, or Qatar or other emerging actors, but we indeed are more of a mediation support actor. We support NGOs, the UN, local organizations, and sometimes we engage in diplomatic efforts, but more to support certain processes rather than really leading them. And maybe 2 examples of how I think this role playing works a bit, and how we as Netherlands engage there. And the first one is in the context of Libya. I think the Berlin process a couple of years ago led to this to an interim government of unity, and by then it was still supported by the 2 parliamentary chambers, of course. And I'm not saying it's like a perfect example, but it does provide an example of how like external actors can coordinate and working together, because actually it really allowed also countries, member states that usually don't engage with each other, end up sitting at the same table and having them needing to engage, right? So I think that's an important element there. And also another thing is that it led to certain the establishment of international working groups with several countries as co-chairs, and the Netherlands was co-chair with Switzerland and UNSMIL. And by then I was seconded to UNSMIL also to support this. But the Netherlands co-chaired the International Working Group on International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. And you saw that like different countries, they focused on specific elements of the peace process, which also led to more focus for these countries. Another, I think, we achieved some kind of impact by influencing other working groups, so to say, in centralizing human rights in their efforts. So as a IHL working group, by convening meetings and certain processes with other working groups, it provided opportunity really to talk about the protection of civilians, right, with the security working group, but also to talk about human rights related to the central bank and engaging labor unions, which in the Libyan context, especially the central bank, is a major important issue in a conflict, right? So it allowed to address like certain root causes. And as a government, you're not you need, and in the Libyan context very much as well, you need to be aware to not be seen or act as like a foreign interference, right? I think that's something that we need to be very wary of to ensure processes are locally led or nationally led. Maybe another example, and I know that this example was referred to by co-panelists, is I think on Sudan, we indeed see a lot of mediators active. And that's also why we as the Netherlands really chose to focus our efforts both by supporting grassroots organizations, peace building, peace mediation organizations, but diplomatically we focus on efforts to the EU. So supporting the role of the EU Special Representative, but also trying to put Sudan higher on the agenda in the EU by establishing this EU contact group of ministers on Sudan. I think that's the kind of role that we can play as a country, as a member state. And then what we there need to do is like facilitate that the experts basically can do their work. So for instance, with this EU special representative, we work together with an organization that we support to ensure track 2 initiatives are linked to the EU's initiative, right? Maybe that for now. I can provide some other examples as well, but don't want to take the floor too long.
No, but thank you so much. You mentioned so many interesting things, also on who the actors are that we need to include. And I think, I mean, on the case of Libya, you mentioned central bank and labor unions. Of course, maybe that would have been our first thought, but as you said, and to refer back to Katja, what is the goal? And indeed, if you need to address root causes, which you were also talking about it on the, so yes, perhaps central bank is a key actor, and that any analysis, that's why it's so context specific, of course, also that's why we can have no blueprint for mediation as such, because in every context it will be different. But and you also mentioned how different working groups can also leverage each other. So I thought that was fascinating, not to mention how you work as a European member state. You're a country, but you're also part of Europe. So you support European efforts, of course, linking then to other regional entities and multilaterals, I'm sure. And then you can support civil society, so like top down, bottom up in a way, which then Berghoff, we talk a lot about multi-track, and I do adhere to it, but I think what it's on us really is to strengthen the linkages between and to sort of clarify that playing field and who plays what role. And it goes to what Katja said about the purpose. I'm going to go back to Katja now, and then I will open up a bit for Q&A, and then we will return back to the 3 panelists. Katja, since you've been in the field for so long, and one of the things that is key for actually, if there is a table, actually getting people to the table is trust. Trust between you as a third party and the parties, but also somehow to create that minimum level of trust between them for the negotiations to be conducive, right? To you, based on your experience, what is necessary to really enhance that feeling of trust? And sometimes we sloppily call them CBMs, confidence building measures as well. And can you, in this sort of dismal day and age, can you give us some hope of what has actually worked? Like what has been some of the success stories? And maybe easier, because I don't know why anyone would want to be a mediator, because we fail more than we succeed, but we just persevere. Anything that backfired and that maybe we can learn from, like don't do that. Katja, over to
you. Thank you, Chris. Trust is a very complicated issue, of course, because it's very specific to the individuals involved and the relationships that we are talking about. But the one lesson that I think we would all agree with is that long-term engagement leads to trust. So in the case of HD, for example, and I'm sure the case of Berghoff and Interbiz, we have been engaging with some of the conflict parties for a good 20 years. One of the processes where we are, unfortunately, I cannot say which one it is again, which currently is very active and quite hopeful, has entailed HD being in contact with the non-state armed group and with the government, I believe, since 2005. So this is the 20th year of engagement. And the consistency, the being with the parties, even in the worst moments of the conflict, still being committed to the value of dialogue and being committed to bringing messages between them and coming up with confidence building measures is one of the most important tools through which the mediator can build this trust. So you stay with the parties even when the conflict doesn't go well. Then the other way to build trust is to demonstrate that you are able to contribute something that they on their own are not able to contribute, to come up with. So, and this is where your term, Chris, comes in, confidence building measures. Professional mediators like ourselves, who have been in the field for a while, have a variety of ideas on how the parties may achieve small wins in the short term, even if they don't manage to solve the problems in the long term. Yeah. And this might be delivering humanitarian access. It may be short-term ceasefires. It might be subnational arrangements that reduce violence. Essentially, something that we are able as mediators to bring to the process that the parties on their own will not be able to contribute. So the capacity of being able to stay involved for the long term, and the capacity to bring something that they on their own will not be able to conceive of, even in the worst moments of the conflict, is a very important issue. If I may, and I know I'm not answering your question by contributing to this, your earlier question of how this sector that we belong to, this non-governmental mediation sector, relates to the official mediation actors. I think it's very important to recognize some of the assets that the non-governmental sector brings, and this maybe also relates to your trust question. And those assets are the capacity to come up with ideas when diplomats may be going between portfolios constantly, and not only focusing on the mediation question that may be on the desk that day. We are specializing in mediation. We think about mediation all the time, so we come up with ideas that they may not be able to come up with. Again, the capacity to engage in the long term, but also the multi-level networks. Official mediators will have networks and contacts and relationships at a particular level, while organizations like Interpeace or Berkov or HD will be able to have relationships from the grassroots all the way to the regional actors. And that's something that allows us to bring what I said earlier, the ideas and the confidence building measures that the parties on their own will not be able to deliver.
Thank you, Katja. That's so important, I think, also in terms of how the investment that has to be made. And in a way, Pema mentioned it a bit, but it has to do with, it sounds very formal, mandate, because a mandate could, of course, be signed and written, but it could be an informal mandate in that the parties actually trust you. And you can see how that mandate is valued by their outreach and them asking you for help. And I do appreciate the fact that we talk, and it might seem confusing to some people when we use different types of terminology. We say mediators, mediation support, negotiations, assisted negotiations, etc. But we're really talking in the sort of same sphere, and then that at different times we play also different roles. But it's in the sort of general peace mediation support, and then you can be a mediator or just supporting a process. It is 1:45, and I have 3 questions from online. They're not easy, huh? So the first one goes, and I think any one of you can give it a try. Against the background of the India and Pakistan conflict and the ceasefire agreement brokered by the US on 10th of May, how does a peace mediator, peace negotiator navigate through misinformation and disinformation in conflict? Between conflicting parties, distorted narratives, misinformation, disinformation. That's a big one for us. Itonde, Katja, go ahead.
Maybe I can start throwing a few ideas for us to consider, Chris. I think one of the first steps that our colleagues take in these situations is to, first of all, do a mapping of who are the influencers online, who are the actors who have the capacity to reach a wide audience, either to influence in a positive way in terms of encouraging dialogue and reconciliation and understanding, or the opposite. And once that is identified, one of the tools that the mediation field considers is to consider how these actors can become part of the mediation process, either by encouraging them to, through a facilitated dialogue, to undertake to withdraw some of the rhetoric from the social media platforms in which they engage, or to tone them down according to agreed upon rules and approaches, or by having implicit understandings with political actors about the timings in which they would or they would not engage in social media. And I guess my main message here is that it's important for us to know the landscape that exists in social media, to not be divorced from it, because it's a landscape that has kinetic impact in our physical realities, and to know who are the important actors in that landscape, and then to find ways to incorporate them in our dialogue efforts. And it has been possible to reach agreements that, to some extent, they comply with, for at least for a short period of time, that regulate when and to what extent they engage in certain types of rhetoric that relates to peace processes when it comes to their online behavior. So that's the first idea that I wanted to share with you.
Thank you, Katja. I think the recent years of sort of social media expansion has really changed the way we do what we call stakeholder mapping, of course, because they are a relevant actor. Itonde, I'm going to ask you another question. Brace yourself. We can all agree that exclusion hampers effective mediation and peace processes, at least implementation also. Consider the inclusion of M23 in negotiations with Kinshasa has shown some promising results, albeit with cautious optimism. What lessons might be drawn from Qatar's mediation effort in the long-standing conflict in Eastern DRC and the Great Lakes region for ongoing and future endeavors?
Great question. Very great question for many reasons. Chris, if you allow me just to dovetail a little bit on the last one.
Oh, yeah.
I think it's linked to your previous question to Katja on trust as well. That my experience is, with regards to the ways in which disinformation is utilized, has everything to do with the trust the parties have in the process itself. And I think here, Katja, you did well to distinguish who we're talking about. There's the general public and social media influencers who may or may not be a part of a peace process. And then there's ways in which parties directly involved in the process or associates utilize information to further advance the process or to bring about a distraction. And if I draw a comparison between a formal process and an independent process where we were providing mediation support to a mandated official facilitator, it was extraordinary to see the way in which the same parties in the formal process used public dissemination of information to undermine the formal efforts, but never once leaked what we were doing or spoke about it. And it said so much about the trust that they had in what they perceived as theirs to protect. And we reflected upon that with the principal facilitator. So I apologize, just to supplement and to further support what Katja said. This example is a critical one, and it's a live one. Firstly, what the Doha process, the Qatari mediation between Rwanda, DRC, vis-a-vis the situation in Eastern DRC brought about was, and it raised the bar in terms of the role of political leadership in bringing about a political solution to a cyclical crisis that has been neglected for so many reasons, and that was taking on new, extremely detrimental forms of humanitarian displacements, active armed conflict, territorial disputes, and more compounding issues, including historical unresolved issues of displaced communities, identity, challenges, and threats, real threats to the existence of a minority population, fueling all of that. So the way in which Qatari mediation was able to show the political leadership coming together at a crucial moment was a powerful message. And what followed in Washington with the foreign ministers equally demonstrated some levels of momentum, including the Declaration of Principles that outlined something more than a transactional, elite-driven approach, that recognized the importance of communities, people, that recognized the importance of wealth sharing, prosperity, and that recognized the importance of partnership beyond the immediacy of Eastern DRC into a broader constellation within the Great Lakes. The real challenge is, how do you translate that in a sustainable way in an environment that has been faced by the most horrific forms of war over the past 30 years? And the opportunity now presented through political processes must also address the question of dealing with the past, which is embedded in current day conflict dynamics. I commend the efforts of both Qatari, US, and regional mediation processes underway, and also from the point of view of including a belligerent party that comes into existence by name on the basis of a previous agreement that failed.
Yeah.
And so it's the right thing to include, but not in exclusion of other communities and other historic grievances, which can culminate, and I know this is not the term of the day, into a comprehensive settlement, as opposed to an elite-driven particular agreement. Chris.
Yeah. Thank you, Itonde. Yes, it has been said that maybe the Colombia peace agreement with the FARC will be the last comprehensive peace agreement we will see in quite a while. Time is ticking, and we only have this 1 hour, and so many topics, and of course so many questions in the chat also that we can't answer. And of course, not mentioning the big elephants in the room, the Ukraines and the Gaza and Sudan, for obvious reasons. But I would just also want to remind you that we're living in I think it's the Uppsala Conflict Database and CIPRI together have said that we're around about 130 conflicts in the world as we speak. And so you can imagine how many of those are not in the headline news. That some of our organizations are, continuously and constantly also working on. I want to end with asking the three of you if you could give just one recommendation, to share one recommendation to either fellow mediators or to donor countries. What would be important to think about when designing these processes? We'll start with Pema. Welcome, Pema. Welcome back.
Thanks, Chris. I'll keep it short, and maybe just it's like iterating what I responded in the previous question. I would really recommend other donors also to continue identifying their own niche. It's something that we as the Netherlands do. We formulated international justice, which all the double standards. It's a big issue as well with the Netherlands, but also water, peace, and security, and psychosocial elements of peace processes. Our, so to say, focus. We have somewhat expertise or a profile there, and I just would like to invite other countries to coordinate on specific context in a more comprehensive way. Where we focus on each of our strengths, and then let's intensively work with mediation organizations who, indeed, like Katja mentioned, play a different role, but a very complementary role to each other.
Identify your niche, I hear from you, but also what you said before about sort of being that accompanying a process through longer periods of time through your other work as supporting organizations such as our own. Katja.
Hi, Chris. I guess my one recommendation would relate to your earlier question on trust. And it would be that we as peacemakers design spaces of trust among conflict parties and individuals and stakeholders of competing views where bold ideas can be floated. There are many issues in international peace and security currently that are taboo, that are difficult to discuss because of sensitivities, because of how they link to geopolitical issues and tensions at the very much at the global level. And if we don't have spaces where we can discuss those issues, we're not going to be able to then resolve the national level disputes or even the local level disputes that we're all working on. And so going back to your issue of trust, having these relationships of trust with stakeholders, being able to create spaces where they can actually say honestly what they think, what their red lines are, and to really float ideas that are possibly naive or even silly. And the challenge current accepted thinking is one of the most important things we can do currently.
Thank you, Katja. And you know what? That actually reminds me of not only creating trust for the conflict parties, but also be aware of, do we have red lines? Or Pema, do you have red lines? And what is difficult for us to talk about or for host governments to talk about? And be honest about that. So a lot more honesty in that relatively safe space would be encouraged. Itonde, it's on you. What's your final recommendation?
I really want to assert a belief in the possibility of peace amidst all these dire statistics, and a belief in peace beyond the immediate. That is to say, yes, we need to broker humanitarian access. Yes, we need to advance ceasefires. But we know that it will also require a longer, more comprehensive vision of what peace entails. To this end, Chris, colleagues, the manner in which conflicts are being carried out, that is to say, the conduct of hostilities, whether adhering or not adhering to international humanitarian law, has consequence for the quality of peace being sought. So too, the manner in which post-conflict reconstruction is going to be occurring with all those 100 to 130 armed conflicts has consequence for the durability of peace thereafter. If it is not a human-centered, eco-centered reconstruction, we can assure you that peace will not be sustained and conflict will erupt again in a cyclical form. So that strong belief in peace beyond the immediate towards a longer term, multi-generational view of what is possible. Really thank you, Chris and colleagues, for the opportunity.
I mean, the thank you is all on my side also for giving us an opportunity for remembering a great conference last year, and inshallah we will have it again at the Berlin Moot. But the belief that peace is possible, I think, is a great segue to continue our work despite whatever we're facing. And Pema, thank you for your participation, and thank you for also sharing what's going on in your own country. And we're also hoping that that will settle peacefully. As I sometimes say, some of my staff will be so bored of hearing it. Of course, you can win a war militarily. It's being done all the time. But then what? I absolutely believe that peace is possible and that there is a role for organizations such as HD, Interpeace, and Berghoff and the others, as well as for governments such as your own, Pema, who really want to support sustainable peace. And thank you, everyone who was attending. I saw a bit up at more than 300 there for a while, so that's very good. I'm very sorry we didn't have time to answer all of your questions, but please join us for our next events and go in peace. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.